I noticed the shift in her before she did. It wasn't obvious at first, just subtle things, changes in her mood, odd cravings she hadn't had before. It started with the food. Claire never cared much for red meat, and certainly never for anything raw. But one evening she asked if I could leave her steak rare. Practically bleeding, she said, her lips quirking in a grin that didn't reach her eyes. It was so out of character that I almost joked about it, but I let it slide, thinking maybe it was just one of those strange pregnancy cravings you always hear about. Her belly was starting to show by then, just a slight curve where our child was growing. Or so I thought. At night, I would lie beside her, my hand resting gently on her abdomen, feeling the faint stirrings beneath her skin. I would whisper things to our unborn child, imagining tiny fingers and toes, the life we'd created together. But more and more, those tender moments were marred by Claire's unease. She would toss and turn, her sleep disturbed by dreams she refused to share. I woke one night to the sound of her crying, soft but persistent. I reached for her, expecting her to lean into my arms as she always did, but she flinched, pulling away. I sat up, staring at her hunched form, shivering beneath the covers despite the warmth of the room. "Claire, what's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. She didn't respond at first, her breathing shallow and erratic. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were wide, glassy with fear, her lips trembling as though she were trying to form words and couldn't quite manage it. It doesn't feel right," she whispered. Her voice was strained, barely audible. "There's something wrong inside me." "What do you mean?" I shifted closer, my heart pounding. "The baby?" She nodded, her hands gripping her belly, fingers pressing into her skin like she was trying to hold something back. "It doesn't feel like a baby anymore, Michael." I felt a sharp tug of unease then, something cold settling in the pit of my stomach. "What do you mean? Claire, it moves," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Not like how it's supposed to. I know what it's supposed to feel like. I know what a baby feels like when it kicks. This thing inside me, it moves like something else, like it's crawling." My breath caught. I tried to stay calm, to rationalize it the way I always did when she got anxious. "Claire, it's just, pregnancies can feel strange, especially as it gets further along. You've read the books, No." She cut me off again, shaking her head vehemently. "It's not normal. It's like there's something alive in there, but it's not our child." I stared at her, searching her face for some clue that this was just some irrational fear, some symptom of a hormone-driven nightmare. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. She wasn't imagining things, at least not in her own mind. She genuinely believed something was wrong. I tried to reassure her, brushing a hand through her hair, though my fingers trembled as they passed over her scalp. "We'll go to the doctor tomorrow, okay? We'll get an ultrasound and make sure everything's fine. You're just..." "Michael," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can feel it. Growing." She looked at me with such raw vulnerability that for a moment, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Like the world I thought I understood had shifted beneath my feet. And now there was this new, terrifying reality taking its place. The room felt smaller then, suffocating almost, as if the air was too thick to breathe properly. My mind raced, searching for explanations, rational ones, medical ones. But underneath it all, in the part of my brain I didn't want to acknowledge, there was something primal. Something that told me Claire wasn't just scared. She was right. I didn't sleep much after that. Neither did she. We lay there in the dark, her body curled into itself, one hand always protectively over her belly, as if to shield it from the outside world, or maybe from herself. Every once in a while, I would glance over at her, hoping to see the peaceful rise and fall of her chest as she finally drifted off. But even when her breathing slowed, her body remained tense, as if bracing for something that neither of us could fully understand. The next morning, I insisted we go to the doctor. Claire barely protested. Her face was pale, drawn, dark circles shadowing her eyes. I tried to coax her into eating something before we left, but she pushed the food away, muttering that she wasn't hungry. It was the first time in weeks that she didn't crave anything, and that unsettled me almost as much as the rest of it. The ride to the clinic was silent, the hum of the tires on the road the only sound between us. I kept glancing at her, watching her fingers twitch against her belly, her eyes staring straight ahead but unfocused, as if she were seeing something far beyond the horizon. She hadn't spoken since last night. At the clinic, we waited in the sterile room, surrounded by bright posters of smiling babies and pregnant women. The air smelled of antiseptic, sharp and cold. Claire sat with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her back stiff as she watched the door with the intensity of a prisoner awaiting judgment. When the doctor finally arrived, Claire flinched, though she tried to hide it. Dr. Evans smiled warmly, the kind of practiced smile doctors wore when they were used to calming anxious patients. But Claire didn't relax, not even when the ultrasound gel was smeared across her belly, cool and slick. I held her hand as the monitor flickered to life, watching the screen intently, waiting for the familiar rhythmic thump of our baby's heartbeat. The image on the screen was blurry at first, then sharper, revealing the shape of what was inside her. But what we saw didn't make sense. There was movement. Too much movement. Far too much for something that should still be developing. The room felt colder the moment the screen came to life. Dr. Evans's smile faltered as he moved the ultrasound wand slowly across Claire's belly, his gaze sharpening. The rhythmic, soft pulse of the ultrasound machine was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over us. I held Claire's hand tightly, my thumb stroking the back of hers, trying to reassure both of us. But there was no comfort in the sterility of that room, no warmth in the gaze of the doctor who was now frowning at the monitor, his brow furrowed. The seconds dragged, each one heavier than the last. Claire's breathing hitched. "What is it?" she asked, her voice raw. She already knew something was wrong. I could hear the dread in every syllable, a crack in the composure she tried so hard to maintain. Dr. Evans didn't answer immediately. He moved the wand again, a little more deliberately this time, as if hoping the picture would change. The screen flickered slightly, revealing the vague outline of our baby, or what should have been our baby. The shape was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it. All I saw was the movement, jerking, erratic, and not like the subtle shifts of a developing fetus. This wasn't kicking. It was something else, something unnatural. Dr. Evans's eyes flicked briefly to us, but he still didn't speak. He seemed to be searching for words, and the silence felt like a looming shadow, choking out the air. Claire's grip tightened in my hand, her fingers digging into my palm as she stared at the screen, her breath coming faster. I could feel her body trembling next to mine, the same terror building in my own chest, spreading like ice through my veins. "Doctor." Claire's voice was no longer a question. It was a plea. Finally, Dr. Evans cleared his throat, his tone carefully measured, but there was no hiding the concern that threaded through it. "There's a lot of movement," he said, still staring at the screen, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "More than I'd expect at this stage. It's unusual." I forced down the lump in my throat, the dryness making it difficult. "What does that mean? Is it okay?" He hesitated. A brief flicker of something passed over his face. Something like doubt. "I can't say for certain right now. We need to run more tests." His voice was strained, the confidence I had always associated with him nowhere to be found. "Sometimes the ultrasound can misinterpret things, give us strange readings, but it's not a glitch," Claire interrupted, her voice flat. She wasn't asking anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the screen, on the jerking shape that was moving too fast, too aggressively, as though it were struggling against the confines of her body. "That's what I feel. That's what's inside me." Dr. Evans' silence stretched long enough to confirm her fears. His brow remained furrowed, and he moved the wand over her again, this time focusing on a different angle. I watched his jaw tighten ever so slightly, a crack in his calm exterior. He knew something was off. The thudding pulse of my heartbeat echoed in my ears, loud enough that it almost drowned out his next words. "We'll need to refer you to a specialist, Claire. There are some additional tests we can run, genetic tests, and a more advanced ultrasound, too, to get a clearer picture." "No," Claire whispered, and then louder. "No, you don't understand." She sat up, jerking the wand from her belly, pushing it aside as though it burned. Her eyes were wide and frantic now, pleading with him, with me. "I don't need more tests. I know something's wrong, something's in there. It's growing too fast, and it's not." "Claire," I interrupted gently, reaching for her, trying to pull her back from the edge. "Let's just listen to what Dr. Evans says, okay? We'll get the test done, figure out what's going on. You might be over..." "No." She pulled her hand out of mine, turning her body away from me. "You don't get it, Michael. This isn't just some pregnancy complication. I feel it. It moves like..." She shuddered, her voice cracking. "It moves like it's alive in the wrong way. It doesn't feel human." Dr. Evans looked from Claire to me, his eyes flickering with sympathy, or maybe discomfort. It was hard to tell. Sometimes, when you're pregnant, it's easy to misinterpret the sensations, hormonal changes, anxiety. They can create... "I'm not imagining this." Claire's voice rose sharply, a frantic edge to it now, her fingers clenching the hospital gown around her belly like she could rip the thing out herself. "It's not our baby anymore. I don't know what it is, but it's not ours." My heart sank as I saw the desperation in her eyes, the raw fear that was etched into every word. She wasn't going to be calmed by logical reassurances. Not this time. Dr. Evans sighed softly, his calm demeanor fraying at the edges. "Claire," he began slowly, carefully choosing his words. "I understand you're scared, but right now, we need to stay focused. The next steps are crucial for both you and the baby's health." He kept speaking, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was staring at the screen, at the flickering black and white image that still haunted the room. It didn't look like a baby anymore, not to me. The shape was twisted, writhing almost, the limbs indistinguishable, the form obscured by something else, something that pulsed and shifted in the dark, grainy image. Something cold spread through my chest as I watched the thing inside my wife move. Claire's breath hitched again, pulling me out of my trance. She stood up abruptly, pulling her gown back into place, her face pale and drawn. "I'm not staying here," she said, her voice shaking with finality. "I don't care about tests. I don't care about specialists. I want this thing out of me. Now." Dr. Evans tried to protest, but Claire was already gathering her things, her movements hurried, her eyes wide with panic. I stood helplessly, caught between wanting to reassure her and needing to trust the doctor. But nothing about this situation made sense anymore. It wasn't just fear that had taken hold of her. It was certainty. And in that moment, standing in the suffocating stillness of the clinic, watching her desperate movements, I began to believe her. There was something inside her, something that shouldn't be there, something that wasn't ours. We barely spoke on the way home. Claire sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands resting protectively over her belly. Her eyes were fixed on the passing landscape, unseeing, her breathing shallow and rapid. The unease between us had deepened into something suffocating, and I could feel it wrapping tighter around us with every passing second. I didn't know what to say to her. Every time I opened my mouth, the words died on my tongue. What could I say that wouldn't make it worse? How could I tell her that I had seen it too? That I now feared what she had feared for weeks? When we pulled into the driveway, she was out of the car, before I even had a chance to turn off the engine. I watched her, my chest tightening as she hurried toward the house, her steps quick and desperate, as though she couldn't bear to be outside a moment longer. She needed to be inside, to be hidden away from the world, from whatever was happening to her. I followed, slower, my mind still racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to be happy, first-time parents, with everything laid out before us. But now, that future had twisted into something else, something dark and unrecognizable. Inside the house, Claire was pacing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked fragile, like she could snap at any moment, and the way she was moving, stilted, tense, made my stomach churn. Her body language screamed discomfort, as if her skin had become a prison she couldn't escape. "Claire," I said softly, approaching her carefully, like she was a wild animal on the verge of lashing out. "Maybe we should talk about—" "No." She cut me off sharply, stopping mid-step, her eyes locking onto mine. "There's nothing to talk about, Michael. You saw it. You know what it is." I didn't respond immediately. How could I? My mind was spinning with questions I didn't have answers to. I had seen something, yes. Something that made no sense. Something that shouldn't have been there. But I wasn't ready to leap to the conclusions Claire had already drawn. I couldn't accept that we'd lost the child we had been waiting for, hoping for, dreaming of. But the fear in her eyes was undeniable, and it gripped me just as tightly as it did her. I don't know what I saw. I admitted, the words hollow, insufficient. But we can't just... "Claire, we need to be rational about this. We need to find out what's going on before..." "There's nothing to find out," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp, biting through the air. "It's not our child anymore. Whatever is inside me, it's something else. Something wrong." Her words hit me like a blow, and I felt myself stagger under the weight of them. She truly believed it. Believed that the thing inside her was no longer our baby. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that fear was distorting her perception, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. That flickering, writhing shape on the ultrasound screen. It hadn't looked right. It hadn't looked like what it was supposed to. Claire's breathing grew more ragged, her fingers clutching at her belly. "It's growing so fast," she whispered, her voice suddenly breaking with exhaustion. "I can feel it, Michael. It doesn't stop. It moves all the time now, like it's trying to get out. Like it's pushing, pulling, stretching inside me. It's not normal. Nothing about this is normal." I moved closer, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away this time, but she didn't relax either. Her body remained stiff, her muscles taut. I could feel her trembling beneath my touch. "We'll figure it out," I murmured, though I didn't know how. "We'll go back to the doctor, get more tests. Maybe it's just something we don't understand yet." Her eyes shot to mine, filled with a kind of desperate intensity that made my chest tighten. "I don't want tests," she said, her voice cold and firm. "I want this thing out of me. Now." The weight of her words slammed into me. "Claire, you can't just... I don't care," she interrupted, her voice shaking but determined. "I can't carry this any longer. Whatever it is, it's not staying in me. It's wrong, Michael. You don't know what it feels like to have something inside you that isn't supposed to be there. I can feel it growing, changing." My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what she was saying. I wanted to believe that this was just her fear, that it was making her irrational. But there was something in the way she spoke, something that made me believe her. And that terrified me more than anything. We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. Claire was spiraling, slipping further into fear with every passing minute, and I didn't know how to pull her back, or if I even could. "I don't care what the doctors say," Claire whispered, her eyes locked onto mine. "I'm not waiting for them to tell me what I already know. I'm getting rid of it, whatever it takes." The finality in her voice was chilling. There was no convincing her otherwise. She had already made up her mind. But I couldn't just let her go through with something so extreme. "Claire, you can't just do that. It's dangerous. For you. If you try to..." Her lips trembled, but her resolve didn't waver. "Do you think I care?" she asked, a hint of hysteria creeping into her voice. "I'd rather die than let this thing keep growing inside me." My pulse spiked. "Don't say that," I pleaded, taking her face in my hands, forcing her to look at me. "You're not thinking straight. We need to be calm. We need to be careful. Please, Claire." She blinked rapidly, tears welling in her eyes, but her expression remained hardened. "I know you don't understand," she whispered, "but it's too late for calm." Her hands trembled as they moved over her belly, pressing hard against the skin, almost as if she were trying to crush whatever was moving beneath it. "It's too late for any of that. I can feel it getting stronger, Michael. It's not waiting for us to figure things out." There was a haunted look in her eyes, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I was truly, utterly afraid. Not just for her, but for whatever was lurking beneath the surface of her skin. Something primal and ancient stirred within me, something that told me she might be right. I glanced at her belly, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw it. A movement, a shifting beneath the surface that was too sudden, too violent for anything human. And that's when I felt it too. The growing certainty that whatever was inside her didn't belong there, and that whatever it was, it wanted out. The night swallowed the house in an oppressive stillness, the kind that made every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seem amplified, as though the house itself were straining under the weight of what was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trapped in a space between worlds, caught in the lingering calm before something terrible was set loose. Claire barely spoke after our conversation, retreating to the bedroom, locking herself inside. I hadn't tried to stop her. The truth was, I didn't know what to say anymore. I stood in the hallway outside our bedroom door, my body tense, ears straining for any sound. I knew she was awake in there, lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I could feel the distance growing between us, an invisible chasm that widened with each passing hour. I wanted to comfort her, but more than that, I wanted to believe her. The rational part of me fought it, clawed at the edges of my mind, screaming that this was all just a product of fear. Pregnancy could be strange. Bodies did things that defied understanding. But deep down, a darker part of me whispered the truth. It hissed in the corners of my mind, reminding me of what I'd seen, what we had seen. That thing on the ultrasound, whatever it was, wasn't right. Claire had felt it long before I was willing to admit it. I didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to give voice to the fear that had crept into my bones. But I couldn't deny it any longer. There was something inside her. The silence stretched on, each minute dragging painfully, and I realized I couldn't stand still any longer. I knocked softly on the bedroom door. "Claire, can I come in?" My voice was quiet, barely audible over the hum of my own thoughts. No response. I waited a few moments, listening for movement inside, but all I heard was the faint sound of her breathing, steady but strained. I knocked again, a little louder this time. "Claire?" Still nothing. A cold sense of unease prickled at the back of my neck, and I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the doorknob. It felt wrong to intrude. Something about the air around the door felt heavy, almost suffocating. But I couldn't just leave her in there like that. I couldn't keep pretending that whatever was happening would just go away on its own. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open slowly. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, casting everything in long, shadowy shapes that made it hard to see clearly at first. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dark. Claire was sitting on the bed, her back propped against the headboard, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her legs, her head resting against her knees, as if she were trying to fold into herself and disappear. I could hear her shallow breathing, erratic and strained, as if even drawing breath had become a struggle. "Claire?" I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. She didn't look up. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible in the dimness. Her words sent a jolt of panic through me. I moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed beside her. But she didn't react, didn't even flinch when my hand touched her arm. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes glazed and distant. Dark circles had formed beneath them, and her skin looked paler, more sunken than it had earlier. She looked drained, hollow. "I can feel it growing," she said again, her hands dropping to her belly, pressing hard against the skin as if she could hold back whatever was inside. "It's moving constantly now. It won't stop." A pang of helplessness surged through me. I didn't know what to say. I reached out, placing my hand gently over hers. "We'll figure this out, Claire. We'll get help." Her lips twitched, but there was no smile, just a dry, bitter twist of her mouth. "Help? You don't understand. This thing, it's alive. It's not our child. It's not human." Her words hung between us, thick and heavy with fear. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was just her mind playing tricks on her, that it was all going to be okay. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The certainty in her voice, the way her hands clutched her belly as though trying to strangle whatever was inside, all of it left me with no ground to stand on. "What if it comes out?" she asked suddenly, her voice thin, fragile. "What if it comes out and I'm still here? What if it hurts me, Michael?" My heart sank, a nauseating dread curling deep in my gut. I couldn't bear to think about it. I couldn't bear to imagine what she was going through, feeling something inside her that she believed was other. Not her child, but something alien, something monstrous. "We're going back to the doctor tomorrow," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but even as I said it, the words felt hollow. Claire had already decided what was inside her wasn't something a doctor could fix. She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "There's no time. It's getting stronger, Michael. I can feel it. It's pushing." Her breath hitched, her hand clutching her belly more fiercely now, and I could see the desperation in her face. "I don't think it's going to wait." I froze. "What do you mean? You're not due for months." Her face twisted, and for the first time, real tears slid down her cheeks. "I know, but it doesn't care. It's not following the rules, Michael. It's not our baby." Before I could respond, she flinched, gasping sharply, her body tensing as though something had punched through her from the inside. Her fingers dug into her skin, and she let out a low, guttural moan. "It's happening," she whimpered, her voice trembling, filled with terror. "Oh God, it's happening." I stood, my hands trembling, unsure of what to do. Panic surged through me as I watched her writhe on the bed, clutching her belly. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear, her lips trembling. "Michael, it's coming. It's coming." I reached for my phone, fumbling with it, my fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911, but Claire's scream cut through the air, sharp and raw. My blood ran cold. She clutched her stomach, her entire body convulsing, and I could see it now, movement under her skin, something pushing, shifting violently inside her. And then I saw it. The skin of her belly bulged unnaturally, something stretching beneath it, pressing outward, as though it were clawing its way out of her. Claire's scream was drowned out by the sound of her flesh tearing. The blood sprayed across the room in a thick arc, splattering across my face, my chest, my hands. I recoiled instinctively, falling back, my eyes wide with horror as I watched it emerge. It wasn't a baby. It wasn't anything that should have been inside her. It was wrong. A twisted, malformed thing, covered in blood and viscera, wriggling and shifting as it tore its way free of her body. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its skin was slick, almost translucent, revealing a mass of pulsing veins and organs underneath. The thing had claws, sharp, black, and glistening in the dim light of the room, and its eyes, if you could even call them that, were nothing more than dark pits, hollow and empty. Claire's scream died into a gurgle, her body collapsing back onto the bed, lifeless and limp. Her chest no longer rose and fell. The creature, her child, sat atop her, covered in blood and fluid, its body twitching, its limbs jerking in erratic, unnatural movements. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare, my body frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to move, to run, to do something. But I was paralyzed. My eyes locked onto the thing that had killed my wife. and then it looked at me. The creature's head twisted toward me slowly, its neck creaking as though its bones were grinding against each other. The dark, empty pits where its eyes should have been seemed to focus on me, and I felt a cold, creeping dread wash over me. There was no recognition, no humanity in that gaze, just hunger. My legs moved before my brain caught up, and I stumbled backward, tripping over the chair by the bed. I hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from my lungs, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to get away from that thing. I scrambled to my feet, my hands slipping in the blood that covered the floor, but I managed to pull myself up, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature moved again, its thin, spindly limbs unfolding, its claws scraping against the bedpost as it began to rise. I bolted for the door, adrenaline surging through me, my body moving on pure instinct. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of its movements, wet, slithering, wrong, followed me as I ran down the hallway, crashing through the house. I reached the front door, yanking it open, and burst into the cool night air, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. But even as I ran, as I left the house behind me, I knew it wasn't over. The thing inside Claire hadn't just killed her, it had been born. And it wasn't going to stop there.